Hello and welcome to MAA. This week's lecture will be on budgets, presented as always by Dr. Martin Roberts. Now the place to start is probably one that you see many times in this, is that really we're looking at the income statements, we're looking at budgets in terms of, in this case, a very simplistic idea from a motivation and a strategy point of view, is that a budget is a plan. Just like going to cinema, you set yourself an amount that you wish to plan for to spend on the night out. You will then compare that to what you actually spent, and then what you do is that you look at that budget and see how you've done. In this case, we've overspent, and therefore we're an adverse variance, or again using OAR terminology, is that we have under-absorbed. So what do we want out of budgets? Well, in essence, we need it to work on two fronts. We want it to ultimately feed back, but really where we should be as management accountants or wanting to run our own business is that we need to think of it from a feed forward perspective. Feedback is what we've just done, whereby we look at our performance against the plan and we react after the occurrence. What we ideally want is we want this idea of feed forward, whereby we set a plan to only spend £20, and during our time at the cinema we stick to that plan. We only pay so much for a ticket and we only buy so much pick and mix. And that's exactly the same as what happens in industry, is you want your budgets to be acted upon before you even know the result. And that's feed forward control. That's the best type of control. And in essence, this is what happens. This is the type of typical diagram you see in your textbooks, whereby you've got a budget, it acts as a comparator, i.e. you compare, and then what in essence happens is that we're in this sort of loop whereby we're trying to prevent us creating adverse variances and hence overspending or not selling everything that we expected to at the right margin. Okay, so what happens is a manager will be given what's known as a set of costs, which is known as a budget center, and as it says there, the manager will be the budget holder, and he or she will be responsible for controlling that budget. And costs can be either controllable or uncontrollable. And what that means is that controllable is the manager can influence, uncontrollable the manager can do nothing about. So potentially depreciation is always a classic in this one, is that if a machine is bought by the manager in terms of in the income statement, well, there's not a great deal you can do about that depreciation. It's already been bought and been depreciated. So ideally that really shouldn't be in the manager's sight, but sometimes is, depending on what control they have on the purchasing of machines. But in terms of being able to influence depreciation, there's very little they can do. So controllable should be more about what exactly you can control, and it really should be, when you design a budget, it should be centered around how the division or the factory works in terms of structure, and then even it can be when you're in larger organizations that you can be a budget holder of entire geographical regions such as Europe or Asia. Okay, so when we're designing budget centers and when we're designing budgets for large organizations, is exactly this, is that we must minimize the uncontrollable and make sure that the controllable goes to the manager concerned. Okay. What we always have when we're looking at budgets is we always have this idea of making sure that when we are presenting data is it must be really according to these 4 points. You've got to create your budget and your results against budget. You've got to create it on time. You've got to create it accurately as possible and as relevant as possible for the right manager. So what you've got to consider is you've got to consider the idea of how much it costs to actually do what we've just talked about and the actual benefit it brings. And what we've also got to think about is accuracy versus speed. So we need something whereby the manager can act upon it right away. If it costs a lot of money to produce very accurate reports 5 days after the event, that potentially is not worth the money. You've got to think about how quickly can you present actuals against budget as fairly accurately as possible so the managers can make a decision. Okay. What I've quoted here is two very influential writers on budgets called Hub and Fraser, and what they say, and what you should always realise is the budgets are limited. We spend hours and hours and hours, months and months and months creating a budget if we let it for the following year, but as soon as you've created that budget, it's out of date. Okay, so as yet again is that what we're trying to do is we're trying not to hide opportunities but to give costs so that managers can manage the business. Okay, where it can go horribly wrong is that we fail to understand one of the key words within budgeting is this idea of goal congruence. You'll see that a lot when you read your textbooks. You'll see that a lot when you're on the internet looking up budgets. Goal congruence is making us all strive towards that one goal. What can happen, and I've seen it happen in real life, is that if you get your targets wrong for your individual managers, they can actually clash against each other. So, as it says at the bottom here, and you've seen it indeed when you've talked about your material variances, is that in a price variance, you would actually be praised for reducing the cost of purchasing of your raw material. But if you do that and you reduce the quality, then you have massive knock-on effects to the rest of the factory. Is that you will worsen potentially your usage budget because you will have more waste, and your labour, certainly your efficiencies, will also actually increase, and it will cost you more money because they can't handle the cheaper material trying to make the same product. Okay, now what else we've got to realise about budgets is that they actually are giving people within your organisation authority to spend. However, what can happen is that if you don't spend it and you're there many years and it comes up to budget time for next year, is if you haven't spent it, then what can happen is that the organisation is scrambling around to save costs and says, well, okay, you've not spent your training budget, so we'll cut it for next year. And so this is part of the problem with budgets, is because they're only set for 1 year, normally 12 months, is that if you haven't spent, say, your training budget by month 10, then they'll say, right, well, we'll cut that, and also next year you can only have 10 months worth of training as opposed to 12. And it becomes ever decreasing circles, and you start to lose the effectiveness of your workforce because they've not been trained properly. And what I've put there is e.g. City Council, is you do see it an awful lot, not just in Sheffield but other city councils, is by whenever their year end is, say March or April is normally a typical time for a council, is that suddenly all the roadworks will appear because they're filling and repairing the roads just to make sure that they use their budget up for next year so they can keep it. Okay. So in terms of budgets, where else can it go wrong? Is that unfortunately that people can spend too long arguing over budgets. And again, just more terms for you to understand, is that you'll hear the word slack or padding, You certainly understand what infighting is. That's where they just squabble over how much money they can spend between departments. But slack or padding is whereby you make it sound far too difficult and you need lots of money to achieve your goals, whereas in fact in reality you don't. And then what happens is that all your energies go into just spending far more time trying to create a budget that will be out of date as soon as you've created it. And this is the worst thing of all, is that managers can get involved in actually being involved in how we depreciate our machines, how we raise our accruals and prepayments. Is that managers can actually get involved in this and start arguing it just so that they look better in the year. But that actually isn't what budgets should be about. So what budgets should be about is it's about motivation. It's about goal congruence. It shouldn't be about beating people up because they didn't achieve budget or having fun taking their resources away. Yeah, you must have competition, but it must be good for the company. It must be stretching to the manager to achieve that budget, but not so much. If it's too easy, you'll give up. And also, if it's too hard, you'll give up. If it's too easy, it seems like a bit of a shock to say you give up. If it's too easy, you're not bothered, you relax. You're like, yeah, whatever, it's far too easy. You want it just right so that people are keen, will work towards it and will achieve something. And as it says here, if you ever set a bonus structure in relation to your budgets, then you must make sure that the personal goals, the budgets and the bonuses that you set will equal the organisational goals. Okay, so there's the aims, is that we must promote goal congruence. We must all work together to create a profit or sell as much as we can, whatever the aim of the company is. We must motivate each manager to achieve that, and facilitate assessment. What we mean by that is very simply what we started with at the first page, is that we can compare one against the other. How did we do? You think about why we've done all these variances so that we can compare actual versus flex budget. If we don't flex our budget, then maybe sales will win and your factory manager will lose out, or vice versa. Factory manager wins, the sales people lose out. Okay, and then retain divisional autonomy. What that means is you just allow people to work on their own and to be masters of their own destiny. So what we've got to worry about is that, as we can say, is that negotiation should be simple. We should allow people to become responsible and to have input into their budgets, and it does again lead to what we mentioned, is this idea of you can be your own boss. I remember one of the firms I used to work for was exactly that, was that you were judged as to whether you ran your division as if it was your own company. But what you've got to be careful of is that despite all that great news about being motivational and rewarding people for that motivation, is that this can take a lot of time, and if you get it wrong it becomes very much an admin process and people lose interest in it. And as always, you can't keep everybody happy. So, what should we do? Budgets, they work well in the short term and if they're organised and written well. However, what happens is that they don't always work, and to be honest with you, they just become a bit of a farce and made up, and just it can be a top-down approach where management just tell the managers what to do. So therefore, in terms of solving the problems, what we've got to do is we've got to have managers involved. So managers have got to have an input, tell people what a stretching target is without taking their own personal gain into consideration. If they can't, well, hopefully they can manage that, but also what we're then going to do is that we mentioned that we spent a lot of time on this idea of flexible budgets. You've already done that. But what's new to you is rolling budgets and zero-based budgeting. Rolling budget is whereby you you have 12 months set out as your budget. But when that, what happens is that if your budget is, say, January through to December, you would set your budget for those months. Then you would let January actuals be reported. And then what you would do is you would put another January onto the end of your December, so that you've still got 12 months rolling all the way. So let's say February's actuals are reported. They replace your original budget numbers, and then you create a new February 12 months further down the line. So what happens is you've got 12 months rolling all the way. The idea behind that is you stay on top of your budget every month for the year, and then when it comes to setting your budgets, then what would happen is that you've got 12 months of data ready to go, and it makes it less bureaucratic process. Now, zero-based budgeting is something that's used in the NHS a lot. What that does is that is all about setting your budget to zero. You start again with your factory, or as it's used a lot in the NHS, with your hospital. And what you do is you say, right, what service do we actually want to provide? Well, for NHS, it's obvious, it's healthcare. But what does that mean? We need so many departments doing this, so many people doing this, and we need so much protective equipment, we need so many operating theatres, we need so much machines. So what you do is that you, like I said, you start from scratch and you build your budget up that way, building up what you need. And then what that should do is hopefully that removes all the inefficiencies that are currently in your organisation. Now, where it's become controversial is that it's around third parties. So if, for example, let's again take the NHS for an easy one, is that you have to feed your staff, and you have to feed your actual patients, and obviously the visitors. So that can be done in-house, or what can be done under zero-based budgeting is you can look for quotes for other people to provide that same service. And as you may or may not have seen on the TV, is that's become a very, very controversial system because everything's contracted out. And with everything being contracted out, you have very little power over what happens when that service is delivered, or even how that service is delivered. You've paid third parties to control that, and it doesn't always work. And so what happens recently is that a lot of contracted out services have been brought back in-house. So zero-based budgeting, it's a great idea, but it has its problems. Okay, so there you go. Just to finish it off, is that a few more phrases that you must need to know is that incremental budgeting is whereby we don't do anything with the budget, we just add a few percent every year. So okay, our costs are 5 million, we'll add 3%, and that'll be our budget for next year. Zero-based I've talked about, and rolling I've talked about, and then obviously the final one as a reducing budget is driving down expenditure. So hopefully that's given you a quick roundup of what budgets are, how they're created, what the motivation is behind it, and also the type of budgets. I will also add some more to this series, so look out for it, and I will see you soon. Take care. Bye.